Awesome. Well, so good to see you guys, and thanks for joining us. So, we kind of just, wanted to open up this dialogue. We really enjoy at the CCD the work of the Rhode Island People's History Museum. So, we just wanted to give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves, the work you're doing, kind of how the Rhode Island People's History Museum came into fruition, and just going to introduce myself and the Center for Conscious Design too. So I'm Grace. I am the Director of Operations and Cultural Innovation with the Center for Conscious Design. So we're kind of this international think tank nonprofit that really focuses on this concept of conscious design and actualizing the conscious cities movement. And so what that means is we focus on getting the right people in the room together to create these like interdisciplinary think tanks, from researchers to community experts to local people to people in governance and policy and health and all these different sectors, to contribute to this larger narrative of what is conscious design and how can we design spaces, cities, areas that respond to their users and kind of create this really dynamic and reciprocal environment that feeds into well-being, inclusivity, equity, kind of like whatever is best supporting the local people. So that's kind of who we are. And yeah, I'd love to turn it over to you guys to introduce yourselves and your journeys and all of that.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself real quick. I'm Daria Montequilla. I'm the community organizer for the Rhode Island People History Museum and the collective, which means I basically talk to anybody of interest on behalf of the Rhode Island People History Museum to get them involved, or see if they have any ideas for maybe exhibits or oral histories or literally whatever. Yeah, and I do some coordination for donations in South County, raising money from the community to give to the community. But yeah, Sarah will have more information since she started all of this stuff, and she definitely knows the history, whereas I do not. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
The collective was co-founded in 2017 by myself and 3 other women. And the idea was that through having a retail space that sold books, not any book, but books that were really thoughtful and intentional as far as what topics they were covering, who the authors were, things like that. That if we had a retail space and also a community meeting space, that we could further discourse, discussion, debate, and then action on the issues that we tend to care about, from education to racial justice to social justice and immigration. And so we've hosted lots of events, and we let other people use the space for free. And it just became clear that there was an appetite to connect this moment and the future with history. So we started to create the Rhode Island People's History Museum, which is constantly evolving, but the idea is to archive movements and people, the stories we don't hear, people's history from the past, and also currently what's happening and what people are saying, doing, organizing around for the future. So we have the museum space, and we'll actually have physical exhibits sometime in the fall or winter. But right now it's mostly exploring topics through interviews and creating digital exhibits and archiving. And then also the other piece, as Daria mentioned, is the collective. We're sort of amorphous, we sort of go with what the needs are and what we're interested in and what other people who are coming in and involved are interested in. And so it just became clear that there was a need for mutual aid during the pandemic. So we started a mutual aid effort, and then it became clear that people are in need obviously all the time. And so why wouldn't we continue this mutual aid effort? So and so I also am on the school committee here, which is probably the worst decision I ever made in my life. But I only have 2 more years. And for my actual like work, I work for the thing I get paid for is I work for one of the teachers unions as an organizer.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for kind of like sharing with us your story and what you do, and a bit more about the collective and the Rhode Island People's History Museum.
Yeah.
I actually live pretty close to the collective. It's one of my favorite spots to go and visit on occasion.
Oh, nice.
Back in South County.
Well, I'm here 12 to 6. Come see me.
Perfect. I'll have to stop by.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, you know, your organization is really organic in the way it works, and is tied not only to promoting local history and storytelling and lived experiences as narratives that kind of like need to be elevated, but it's also really takes that grassroots approach in like the fabric of how it operates too. So not only elevating the lived stories and the voices of people, but morphing your journey to kind of respond to those immediate needs. And so I think that's a really great and essential kind of component to have. And I was wondering, kind of in your storytelling, kind of how you see storytelling as being kind of essential to history, and how we don't integrate that kind of like local narratives and storytelling into history as we normally tell it, you know, in the school districts and now, and just in society in general.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, because honestly, history was never my thing. But this project is just so exciting because it's unique in that it tells the stories of like more marginalized communities, or stories that are neglected or ignored or purposefully suppressed. And just like knowing your history is so indicative of the present, which is like obvious, but like it's not something we truly think about. And you really have to know your history in order to like not repeat it. And you just like we just don't know most of the histories. We know what we've been told by textbooks. But for example, yesterday we were doing an interview with this man who wrote his own book on like the heavy policing of Los Angeles. And he was talking about like these different organizations that were created in response to the heavy policing of people in Los Angeles, especially after like the riots. And so, for example, he said, like, there was this organization that would, like, drive around and follow, like, policemen to just, like, make sure that when they're pulling someone over or whenever they're doing their, like, job, that they're doing their job and they're not being corrupt or violent or anything. Mm. And there were just, like, a lot of similar, like, programs or organizers that wanted, like, to create these sort of like task force or like accountability boards or like organizations that would relieve some of the like duties and pressure of police. And that's exactly something we're trying to do now, is like trying to find different ways to get what the police are supposed to do done. Like traffic incidents, do you need a cop with a gun to pull you over? Probably not, for your dead taillight. So just like things like that is like knowing the unique and like smaller histories that mean a lot for what is going on right now, especially since we're trying to capture what's happening right now and not only in the past. That is very valuable to people in the future, because like, for example, I really want to catalog and like archive posters that people are using right now during their protests. Because a lot of the things they're saying might be indicative of hopefully not indicative of we're positive about it and not repeating it, of problems and solutions in the future, and definitely indicative of similar problems in the past. Like, yeah. So just the really like minuscule little moments of history just mean so much. And they're always glossed over. Like, you wouldn't read that in a textbook, that there was like an organization following policemen around, making sure that they're being held accountable for their actions. Yeah.
Sorry, this is my life. Like 17 people stop in, like in the middle of my kids run by. And anyway, so I think I have like sort of two trains of thought on this. One is the impact of stories we know is like really powerful, right? In general. And so like one of the things we're interested at the People's History Museum is two questions, like how do we utilize oral histories that we're doing with folks in a way that others can actually hear them, experience them, learn from others. And I think stories really bring a sense of empathy that maybe like hard, cold facts don't do. And then the other piece on the oral histories is that there is a tradition of lots of oral history projects being done in Rhode Island. We hear about them all the time from the 70s, 80s, before that. And yet they're not accessible. They're stored somewhere, they're not digitized. And then there's a question of, even if you digitize them, like how do people listen, right? I mean, that sounds so simple, but like, are people going to listen to a podcast or on a website, or does it have to be part of a exhibit? So I think storytelling is really important because it elicits empathy, emotion, understanding in a way that facts don't. But I think the other part of the question for me is, why this matters, right? History in general. And I think that, like I think about myself, and I wasn't very good in school, and I didn't really like school. It took me till I was 29 to graduate from even getting a bachelor's degree. But then I went on, I got a master's degree, and but it took me a while. And I think part of it was because like for K-12, it just wasn't an experience that like really delighted me or brought joy. I didn't really think learning was in me. I wasn't a learner. And I think about like some of that is, I think about when I went to college in my freshman year, I was in a people's history class, because I happened to get into college on a scholarship. And Julian Bond was coming to my class. We were reading Howard Zinn. We were reading Priscilla Merillo. And for the first time in my life, I saw myself in history, because even as a white woman, like I was a poor, like working class white woman, and just didn't ever hear the story of like class conflict or class heroes, labor heroes. And so I think part of what we want to do is like strive to do that at the museum, and strive to do that while we like push for systemic change in institutions at the same time. Like mandatory ethnic studies should be a thing. And at the same time, we should be integrating all cultures, all races, all ethnicities, all genders and sexualities into every bit of curriculum, right? And so I think we're a place where, while we do the sort of education piece, we're also going to do the organizing and pressure piece, because it's urgent. These issues are urgent. And I think that, sorry, one last point. I think that it's by design, right? That we hear a very whitewashed history in the news, in schools, and that has to do with power and and white supremacy. And I just feel like, we have a responsibility to sort of buck that and fight for a different way to understand history, so that we can, prepare and fight for like a different future.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much for both of your really powerful insights. I couldn't agree more. Growing up in South Kingstown, there's definitely a huge lack of representation in what I saw in the curriculum, from kindergarten through high school. And it kind of leads me into, this more general question I have about kind of like, what do you see as being the defining concepts and structures of racial inequality, and how can storytelling be a tool? How can history be a tool to combat that?
I'll let Sarah go first, because I need to think.
Wow, that's a hard one. I don't think I know, right? Like for myself, I'm on a journey to be anti-racist every day, right? And it is hard work, and and you have to like analyze systems and structures, as you said. And I don't really know. I think it's complicated. I think there are lots of ways that these like this social construct of race, and it's a power construct too, right, has been created and then utilized to sort of keep some folks from living a full, wonderful, beautiful human life that we all deserve, every single person. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that happens in schools. I think it happens in housing. I think it happens in the way voting districts are segregated. It's everywhere in language. And so I think that the thing that we have to do is be conscious of it and like challenge ourselves and challenge each other to be better, to like, even when it's wildly uncomfortable, to do the right thing and speak out and take action against racism, the way it manifests itself into every single piece of our society. And I think history helps do that, partially because, you know, more marginalized communities don't see themselves represented in history, which is like erasure. And then white folks, especially white male men, get a different understanding of like their role in history if we don't tell the real stories and all sides of things as they're happening. We're just then, you know, sort of continuing this march forward of white supremacy and patriarchy and all of those things.
Yeah, I don't really have a response. That was just good. Can you say the question again? I got lost in her.
Yeah, so the question is kind of, how do you think storytelling can be a tool to overcome racial inequality, and just in general, you know, like what do you see as the defining factors of racial inequality?
Man, just like it's just super generational, like you know, it's just like passed down and passed down and passed down and distorted. Like police, for example, were like, I believe this is history, you know, that they were like created in order to like be slave capturers for when like slaves ran away. And it just gets distorted and like changed, but not really, because like the effect of it is still similar. You're still having the same outcomes. Black people are being killed, Black people are marginalized, and they're over policed. And not a lot of people know the history that that's what it was literally created to do. So policemen are never, like, the police system is never going to help Black people because it was never designed to, which is just something I like learned more about yesterday with that interview. I forgot what else I was going to say. Yeah, so just like passing down legitimate stories is beneficial. And they're always going to get distorted. That's why I think like archiving them now is very important, because something similar could be created now that is distorted down the line. For like example, Black Lives Matter is becoming like super distorted. And a lot of people think it's like only Black Lives Matter when it's like all lives matter, but Black Lives Matter because they're being ignored. Like, this is the ignored one, and we're not saying that all lives don't matter, but it's possible that that gets distorted by all like the like opposing, I don't want to say racist, but all the racists that don't agree. Is all like, I'm just seeing so much on Facebook, just like people, my mom just sent this argument to me that she was having with someone on Facebook because they were making posts saying like, don't go to fast food because there's a like nationwide attack and like Black workers are like poisoning or messing up like fast food and serving it to like white people in order to harm them. And like, that's just not the case. So I think it's really valuable to like start, like tell the stories as they are from like the correct point of view, and make sure that it lasts and doesn't get distorted. And that's why you have to archive them in the moment, especially because I'm sure that like police, when they were drafted, weren't like writing down like, I'm sure they were very proud of them catching slaves, but I'm sure like once they moved on from that sort of system, where that sort of like goal is to catch slaves, they're like not going to continue to publish that. And that is not something anyone knows now. Not anyone, but most people. So yeah.
Can I add one thing? Because you made me think of something, Daria.
Yeah.
I was thinking about like white folks. So, like, I think oftentimes we see from white people, especially working class white people, I mean, lots of this has been written about this, but misplaced anger, right? Where, you know, people are angry or frustrated, or our economic system, our social systems don't work for anyone besides like a very small white male, generally minority. And so we punch down and we attack people of color, immigrants, Black folks. And I think like part of the value of stories is that you can recognize the humanity of other people, and that their experience actually are very similar to your experience. Because frankly, pardon my language, but we're all getting screwed, right? It's just that like white people get wrapped up in police brutality too. White people get wrapped up in a ridiculous criminal justice system. It's just like also true that the majority of the police brutality, the majority of the things wrong with the criminal justice system are attacks against Black people. And so we have to have conversations and tell stories so that, you know, people have an understanding of like, of who's at fault in the world right now with the problems that there are and why we all can't live full lives. And we also have to recognize, I think, that yes, there are things that are happening to all of us that impact all of us, but some things, a lot of things, because of racism as like a deeply held American ideal, unfortunately, are impact Black people way worse. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, it does, and it's designed to. So.
Right. So like what?
Like. Anyway, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, so I was gonna say kind of like what I'm hearing is a lot of the power of storytelling, of localized history, is to have the empathy to listen and understand the complexity of history, especially of populations and people that are often not represented or whitewashed in history, and kind of like use that empathy and that spark of conversation to bring forward both like a reckoning with the past and hopefully like a redirection for the future.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would just add one more thing that I thought of. I didn't really say it well. I'm trying to Google how to say this name, but it's inspiration, right? Like sometimes I meet people all the time, like these young folks in South Kingstown right now who are doing amazing work. Amazing. And Daria, I should say, she's not gonna take credit for it, but she's also doing amazing work. And organizing and activism is hard. And it is, sometimes you have awful days and very, very seldom do you win, right? Like that's all true. And so history and stories of history inspire people and like help us like reflect and keep fighting for a better, more just world. And at the same time, like, you know, I think like I just the other day was thinking about this abolitionist in South Kingstown, George Fairweather, and you know, there's a house here and there's a shop inside the house, and yet I know like nothing about him, right? Like, and my point is like I want to seek that out. I think lots of people want to seek that out and we want to share those stories and help people share those stories, because it's not like there are amazing people like everywhere, amazing stories and historical figures everywhere. And it's almost like uncovering those and celebrating a bit about the people that came before us.
Definitely. Yeah. So I guess like in kind of in what you're saying, I'm wondering, you know, given your experience both in life and with working to do this like whole storytelling project, how would you kind of describe, like you said, the life of an activist is never, you know, it's never easy. There's lots of up and downs. So like, how would you describe racial disparities that you've seen, you know, in our local Peacedale community, in the US as a whole, and kind of like oppressive structures, systems that you see as being something that we can work towards changing with storytelling?
Yeah, that's a big one. I'm not sure, like, I feel, thank you, maybe storytelling is just like the first part of it. It's not necessarily like obviously like the solution,
Mm.
but once you just get people in a room sharing their experiences, it's harder to like, what's the word? Like separate yourself from the humanity of the situation. Like, it's one thing to like hear about the death of George Floyd, and then it's another to sit in the room with his family or even watch their speech that they gave a few weeks ago. And that's just like the first part of it, is like getting real human like backup, like just putting a face to the story, because you're like, you hear stories all the time, but they're so often disembodied, especially in textbooks. So like when you read a textbook, like, I don't want to say you don't care about like slaves, because obviously you care about slavery, but it's harder to like internalize it and empathize with it more, just because it's so cold and clinical, especially in a textbook. And there's no real people to talk about, except for like, once you get to the railroad, you start hearing about Harriet Tubman and you hear about Sojourner Truth, but those are just like a couple people. And you hear about abolitionist Frederick Douglass, but that's just not those are three names, you know. And it's hard to empathize with three historical figures that that like you never would, like, it's just so removed from the 21st century. So you're seeing a woman in like a corset and long skirt, and you're like, well, that's forever ago, so I don't have to worry about it. But when you talk to like people now whose like grandmothers and great grandmothers were slaves, and how that has still affected them, because upward mobility is like damn near impossible in such a capitalist, like class-centered society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think storytelling kind of might allow for more of a journey to like more success in getting like changes, because it just really personalizes it instead of like generalizes it, yeah. Because another thing, now that like social media is so like pervasive in our society, we're getting more personal stories and we're sharing them all over Facebook. Whereas like before, you would have seen on the news, you would have seen Martin Luther King, you would have seen everyone at the protest, and whatever little person got like caught for like their 15 seconds of fame by a newscaster. But now we're getting like personal stories, like, this is what I literally just went through, this is my live feed of me getting hit with rubber bullets. And like they are able to get their whole narrative out there without having to like be approached by a newscaster or news organization, and they can just publish it themselves, and it makes it personal and it makes it realistic and it's in time. So just using that as like a stepping stone to drafting like policy changes you would like to see is, I think, really valuable, because you get a bunch of people with a common experience that might not have known that was a common experience until it's shared. And I could go on forever, but that's that.
Thanks, Daria.
That was awesome. Can you tell me the question again? Sorry, I kind of got lost in my head.
Yeah, no worries. So just kind of thinking about your experience, with the Rhode Island People's History Museum, with storytelling, and in your life, how have you seen racial disparities play out, both locally in Peacedale and in the US? And how do you think we can use storytelling as a tool to overcome those disparities?
So I guess I want to start off big picture a little bit, is like, so I'm a mom of 2 boys, and I think that there are moments in this world that like something happened on a big, like somewhere else, like on a national scale, that just became a real like reflection moment for me. I think I was not like sort of woke up like feeling woke. I didn't grow up feeling woke about race or a lot of things, actually. I grew up very, like, again, working class white, and the culture can sometimes be a little like awful when thinking about people that don't act like you. But I remember when I was in community college, Diallo was shot in New York, the 21 shots by the police. And it was the first time, like, I really thought about, like, I didn't grow up like loving the police, for example, but the idea that someone pulling out their license and their keys would get shot 21 times, like, blew my mind as like I guess I was like a 19-year-old. Like, that was just seemed crazy to me. And that's an awful thing. And people shouldn't have to get murdered for like me to have woke up a little bit or thought about something a little more. But it happened. And for me, it was like, just kind of was the first step on a journey, that story, that experience that happened to this poor man, to really think a little bit more about what was happening in the world. Because I had the privilege of not thinking about race. And then, so my point about being a mom, I think a lot about children, especially little boys. And I think a lot about Tamir Rice. I think a lot about Trayvon Martin. And the fact that both locally and everywhere, like, we don't allow children to be children, especially when they're Black, and that we assign criminality to children, and that we all, like, our society seems completely okay with that. That's a big problem that I think we also can, we have to get like militant, we have to be militant and make demands, but I also think telling stories helps to understand why there's like a problem with how we sometimes, like, our biases and how deadly those biases can be, right? So I just say that sort of from the national context, and that's why stories matter. And I think when we look at the issues, I mean, we can look everywhere, right? Like health equity. Our friend Shonda from Arise will talk to us about health equity during Corona for people of color and the racism that sort of impacted their access to care and testing. The maternal health rate of Black women is insane. I'm sorry, maternal death rate is insane. And the way I even learn about these things is by smart people telling their stories and what they know, or their experiences, and I can just relate differently. I think everyone can relate differently to a story. Education, both the representation, discipline, I mean, there's a million different problems there. Economic discrimination, ability to access like higher paying jobs. So I think like there are so many different, I mean, like I don't want to like beat a dead horse, but racism is so ingrained into our society and our policies and practices that I think stories help us make this shift that needs to be made, which is this, like Ibram Kendi says this brilliant thing, like there's no such thing as a colorblind policy or law, right? Mm-hmm. It is either racist or it is anti-racist. And so I just know for sure, like we don't have a lot of like anti-racist statutes and policies here in the town where I live. And so we must have racist ones. And if that's true, then we have to sort of have discussion, dialogue, and tell stories about experiences so that we can get to the place where we're ready to demand change.
Definitely. And so like following up on that, I guess, in your experience working with the Rhode Island People's History Museum, Daria, I know we were talking a bit before we really got started about something you're doing more on like the educational front. And I was wondering if you could give any like specific examples of how you've started to use storytelling in what you're doing to kind of combat racism.
Hell yeah. So I'm a facilitator in like these community meetings that we're doing outside of the building, just because it's outside, where like I'm kind of listening to the members in the community, especially because I'm not from South Kingstown, just like what the changes they kind of want to see. And a lot of the changes they wanted to see ended up being about like school reform and educational reform, and like on like the curriculum and on discipline and on accountability and on student to student and student teacher relationships. And a lot of the demands came from some like previous students or current students sharing their like stories about like, because the majority of the meeting was white, so it was like stories about personal things that like they've personally seen. For example, one girl was wearing like short shorts and she was white, and her friend who was a person of color was wearing similar short shorts, and they both got in trouble. But later she saw the person, like the girl of color, being like chastised and sent home, even though she was like just free to go, like with a little warning. Just because I feel like she felt like the like Black bodies are very over sexualized, and I would agree. So a lot of the demands came from like just people's individual experiences in school, because especially since it was so centralized to South Kingstown, it was things that people in that went to South Kingstown schools have seen. And so it wasn't just like problems that they assumed to exist or that like they read up about. It was things that they'd actually experienced and they wanted to change. One member was upset that the GSA was headed by a cis white woman, and that was kind of from their own like experience in the GSA. And there was just like a lot of different little stories that people were sharing, and then at the end of it, like, so what do you want? Like, why are you sharing the story? What would you like to come out of sharing it? And so one of the demands for the girl who was dress coded was to end the hypersexualization of students of color, especially in like dress code. And then there was another story where this girl's two like biracial brothers were constantly in trouble, always like getting suspended, and just because like people, like students of color, are just like over policed as well in their own schools. They have like higher suspension, higher dropout rates, just because the school to prison pipeline is so real. Once you're branded as a problem child, it's going to follow you. And so just people were just sharing like what they've experienced firsthand in schools, and out of that came like an amazing list of demands that they were able to share with the school committee on Tuesday.
Yeah, I think I would just add like stories allow us to, when people are telling stories, to build community and recognize actually the things that are to celebrate, to love, to appreciate about different cultures and community. I mean, they allow us to really understand experiences that are beautiful. Again, like understanding the full humanity of every person, right? And so there's that piece. And I think when there are issues, there's also the piece of what Daria just said. When someone says there's a discipline problem in South Kingstown schools based on the, based on the rate of discipline and how different it is based on the color of your skin, you know, that is something we should do something about. But when you hear someone's like experience or like a very specific story, it just elicits more action. It just elicits more empathy. And I think the thing we just have to be really careful about, and I was actually reminded about this yesterday from a friend of mine, is that we at the same time can't put the onus on Black folks or the BIPOC community to like relive traumatic events so that we can learn, right? And so you just have to be, I think, really careful and intentional to sort of both like recognize the full humanity of people and also not sort of put people into a corner where they have to relive traumatic events. And this is a little like side note, but I just thought of this. Like, for example, at the Collective, we sell a bunch of books. And, you know, we tend to sell social justice, racial justice books, and we have children's books. And about 2 years ago, I was reminded, like, it is great to have the Fannie Lou Hamer book. It is amazing to have, we just got Overground Railroad in, but like, we also just need to see like basic representation of like children at the beach who are Black and kids of color. And so that was like a learning and reminder for me, right? Oh, like what story are we telling if we only have the children's books about struggle?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on a little bit to what I was saying earlier, just real fast. I think that like sometimes people kind of know what they want to see, but they don't know how to say it, so they just relate it to their personal life. And I think that getting a bunch of people in a room sharing stories is very valuable because we all have different levels of education and different levels of like organization and governments and like wherever we are in our lives, and like just sharing stories kind of will like create the solution, maybe like it like together. because some people were just like younger, they didn't really know how to word the demand, but just like trying to extract their stories and being like, well, what would you like to see out of that? Even if they necessarily didn't know before, it helps them get to it by relating it personally.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. It's a really good point and like insights. And one question that I have kind of following up on something you said, Sarah, was about this, like, we want to educate and share stories and make sure that history is representational, but at the same time, it's a fine line with not putting the ownership and kind of like re-traumatization on people of color, on the Black community, to kind of like teach white people their history. So I guess, like, how have you navigated that, and how do you walk that line of education and not putting that ownership and re-traumatization on that community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a fine line, and like, you know, luckily, like, people that I work with are generally like sort of forgiving when I mess up, because inevitably we're all going to mess up a bit. But I just think it's two things. One, the key thing is follow the lead of people of color, right? Follow the lead, follow their ideas. It's part of why the museum, right, isn't just like, and we're going to tell this story about your culture community. No, we're going to open up this space and let's work together and figure out, like, what's the story here about Nineveh, and when it was both a plantation, and then later when it was almost a power plant, right? Like, what's the story there, and how do we bring in other people to help us tell it? So that, I think, really helps, like, follow, and organizing too, like, follow the lead of the impacted communities. That's that simple. And then the other thing I would say is, I lost it. Wait, what was the other thing I was going to say? Okay, the other thing I would say is, making sure you're recognizing the full story, the full humanity, right? And I think you do that through relationship with people, right? Being intentional about, like, surrounding yourself with people that have different experiences than you, different ages, different genders, different ethnicities and races. Like, you have to sort of like pull from different communities. And I think our partnership also with other community organizations help us, and will continue to help us make sure that we're not taking any relationship, any exhibit, any story to a place that's both not representative, but re-traumatizing.
I also just want to add to that, because it is a people's history museum, so you're dealing with people, and it's really important to just like establish a relationship with them and like a sort of trust. Like, I'm like reaching out with DARE on behalf of the Rhode Island People History Museum, but so far all I've done is like meet with Kia Bryant and talk about like our lives and stuff, and just like creating an actual friendship, I think, is very valuable. So then you like can have like a free dialogue about like what makes you comfortable to share, like, and just being very intentional about what you want to come out of this, and acknowledging like their hit, like that nothing happens in a vacuum, that they have an experience, that they have emotional response, that they might have been through trauma, that like we're living on like stolen land, we're going through a pandemic, there's like racism everywhere. So just like acknowledging that they are having like personal responses to everything going on, and that you just have to make sure that they're comfortable with whatever.
You made me think of something. And like, for me, it's also just giving people an outlet to, like, right on the web series, like tell like your story, use your voice. And I think we have to show up and be like, and you build trust, right? Through like what Daria shared through conversations, but also showing up to other people's fights and battles. And when we do have privilege, use that for good. Be co-conspirators with our allies of color, or allies that identify differently than each of us.
Yeah, I really like that co-conspirator lens.
I stole it from, I think it was Dr. Bettina Love. It's not mine. I just want to put that out there. As usual, it was a woman of color, a Black woman, who came up with something brilliant, and like I want to like, you know, make sure like I'm not like stealing it. So I think it was Dr. Bettina Love.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's great to have, you know, kind of that, like, and it really does go back to the empathy, just the essence of human connection. right? Is like to drive you forward in just the pure form of listening. So
sorry, my children are starting to demand food. That's why I'm a little distracted suddenly.
No worries. Yeah, we're kind of coming to the end of it soon anyway, but I guess something that I wanted to kind of ask you guys about before we depart is, based upon your experiences, what do you view as needing to change, and what can people do like in the here and now to make a tangible impact on racial disparities, and especially with everything going on right now?
Man, I just want everything to change. But I guess the biggest thing is just being vocal about it and not stopping being vocal. I understand that the hype may have gone down a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but you just cannot stop being vocal. And I think that is the number one thing, because once you keep the narrative going, it just will continue to domino into hopefully something good, because no one's been quiet about arresting those cops that killed George Floyd, and then they got arrested, even though one of them posted bail. But like, it happened, and that would not have happened unless everyone was vocal, and especially the white allies, because the world doesn't always listen to like Black people, even if there's tons of them. Like, getting allies is very, very key and important. So I just think like just not being silent in anything, because silence is violence.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think that because racial injustice exists everywhere, you can do something everywhere, unfortunately. And so for me, it's always like, just organize where you're at, wherever you're at. Are you in school? Organize there. Are you just in a small town? Organize there. Like, and you don't have to decide for those who are impacted, like what the solutions are, but you can speak up and you can build relationships with those most impacted really on any issue and take action. And I think that's all we can do. And like Daria said, direct action gets the goods. Like when we show up, when we vocalize and demand things from decision makers, like it does tend to change. It might take some time, but eventually the change happens.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much. I also wanted to like take this time, if there's anything else that you feel like is important to impart to anyone who were to watch this, or anything else that you want to communicate, like I want to open up that space for you as well.
Follow us on Facebook, RIPHM. Yeah, and just honestly, if anyone is watching this and they have like a box of photos that is interesting in respect to history, if they have a story, literally, if they have anything, just reach out to us, because it's probably cool and we probably want to hear it, even if we do like a little oral history interview, or give you a platform to publish a little narrative, or we do an online exhibit. And just reach out if you have something, anything.
What Daria said sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for talking
to people.
Yeah,
even if you don't think it's worthwhile, share it.
Thank you so much.
This is awesome.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you guys. Definitely a lot to think about. And, we're going to use these web series kind of going forward to influence how we think about designing society for racial equity, right? So like not only the physical and urban architecture, but education, policy, governance, the more like stickier and invisible components. So I really appreciate guys sharing your knowledge and taking the time to talk to us and kind of share what you're doing too.
Yeah, if you ever want to come to one of our Sunday meetings, like feel free to ask me, and like you can come talk about what you guys do, and like ask some questions on what people would like to see, like design wise, and just like anything that you, because like I know a large part of it is like getting people in a room, and like these aren't necessarily like experts, but these are people who like live, and they have things that they want to see. So if you ever want to come by, we have really smart people, and I'm sure they'd love to hear. I'm sure you even know some of them.
Oh yeah, I would love that. Definitely.
Cool.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Okay. All right, bye. We're done now, right?